Okay, folks, I think we're going to get going. This is Steve Fish. I'm the Executive Director of Canadian Business for Social Responsibility. I wanted to welcome you to today's webinar, Climate Change and Carbon Pricing, What You Need to Know. This is very timely and topical. 2015 is poised to be an incredibly important year for climate change negotiations at a global level. So we wanted to start more regionally and get a little bit of context about Canadian attitudes towards climate change and our government and industry's response to climate change through carbon pricing, and but also understand some of the overarching concerns that Canadian citizens may have, and then get a little bit into some of the background around the response in BC and Alberta and Quebec, and more recently Ontario's announcement to join the California-Quebec cap-and-trade model, for example. So we've got two great speakers with us today. Eric Wong from GlobeScan will start us off, and then we'll hear from Alex Wood from the Sustainable Prosperity. So without any further delay, we'll get into the content. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items. You'll notice up on the screen now in the WebEx feature that there is a chat box. So if you do have any questions throughout the course of the presentations, please use the chat feature. My colleague Stephanie will be monitoring that, and we'll take a couple of pauses throughout the presentation to answer questions. And if there aren't any questions, we'll reserve some time at the end of the call so that we can ask some questions from those of you that are on the call. So the chat feature is the way to go. You can also ask us sort of questions about the mechanics of the webinar if you have any using that feature as well. So I think we'll get started with Eric from GlobeScan. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Steve. Great to have the invitation. Wonderful day to be here, springtime in Toronto. Thanks for having me on. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Eric Wong. I'm Sustainability Director at GlobeScan, based in Toronto. We are a boutique stakeholder engagement and intelligence consultancy. That's another way of saying we're an opinion research firm that specializes in strategic issues, leadership, and trust. And we've been doing a lot of work around sustainability for the last 2 decades in Canada and internationally. One of our regular research programs that we conduct here in-house is called GlobeScan Radar, which tracks across 20-plus countries expectations of major societal actors like companies and like governments and NGOs. Involved in that are perspectives on leadership and trust and limitations and constraints. And we track a lot of issues, of which climate change is, of course, a big one. So it's exciting because today we have some very fresh findings in from Canada for our 2015 radar program that I'm privileged to be able to share with you for the first time. And I think they're highly relevant to the context with which we sit today around carbon pricing. Slide. We know that in terms of the sort of social context and the public opinion context over the past several years, it's all been characterized by volatility, by public anxiety, by complexity and uncertainty. Issues have been moving up and down, and for major decision makers in governments and companies, it's been incredibly difficult to get things done. And I think one of the things I've picked up anecdotally on the climate file is that companies have been really constrained in terms of being able to make plans because there has not been any certainty on the regulatory frontier. And now we're starting to see some, which is great, but it's interesting to look and see how we got there because it's a little murky. To start with basic context, it's helpful to look at what citizens around the world think is the most important problem facing their nation today. And you can see on the map here in blue that it's really characterized by economy. In only 1 or 2 countries do environmental issues register as sort of top of mind. And that's particularly in China, where air pollution has been incredibly tangible for people. And yes, related to climate change, but nowhere is climate the number 1 issue. Slide. So what we have to do is sort of prompt people to tell us how serious they think a number of societal challenges are facing their country. And here we get kind of a slightly different landscape when we average views across 21 countries. And we see that the perceived seriousness is highest for a whole set of issues that relate to sort of personal security. So we have crime and violence, unemployment, food security, energy security, and poverty and homelessness coming out as the top issues. Environmental pollution, while not at the very bottom of the hierarchy here, is a middling issue, but it's not up at the top of the list. But we can break that down a little bit to see if we get any closer to climate change as being something that's very urgent for people. So here we look at the ranking of a whole set of specifically environmental issues, and on the map are shown symbols for the ones that score most highly in people's minds. And you can see that it's all about water in many, many countries. In only one country is climate change ranked as the most serious environmental challenge, and that, of course, is Germany. Perhaps no surprise there. But just one little anecdote. I was at a conference in London last year, and Paul Dickinson, who's executive director of CDP, had a great quote. He said, "We all know that climate change is the shark in the pool, but water is his teeth." And of course, CDP is more involved in the water field. So water is really sort of a manifestation of concerns around climate for people. Next slide, please. I mentioned volatility, and here we see our time series dating all the way back to 1998 on the perceived seriousness of various environmental issues. A lot of up and down, but between 2013 and 2014, we see quite a sharp drop across all of the issues that we've tracked, and so it almost feels like, you know, advocates working in the space are sort of losing the room, that there really hasn't been any progress. And when we go to and must point out that climate change is third from the bottom in terms of perceived seriousness. It's the more immediately tangible challenges that are less esoteric for people, easier to grasp, like water and resource depletion and air pollution that score higher in concern. On the next slide, we look at climate change specifically, and here we can see where Canada is ranked in terms of perceived seriousness. So somewhere near the middle, but tending towards the bottom half. You can see on these line charts that concern has declined quite a bit in a number of countries. In Canada, it was down about 5 points between 2013 and 2014. So not a major precipice here, but still down. Like there's no sort of peaking in concern about climate change at the current moment. Next slide, please. Now, there's some nuance here, because what I just showed you was perceived seriousness, and that can be interpreted as the extent to which individuals see society taking an issue seriously, the extent to which they see leadership, the extent to which they see issues as high on the agendas of politicians and businesses. Instead, when we ask about concern, we see somewhat of the reverse effect here in our work with National Geographic tracking concerns and sustainable consumption from 2009. Instead, in a majority of the 18 countries that we've tracked here, we see an increase in personal concern about climate change. So a little bit of an uptick, and we see that for other issues too. But in Canada, again, no big move between 2012 and 2014. Concern about climate change is just up. So it seems that people do care about these issues, but they just have not been seeing the leadership. Now, that was a bit of a retrospective drawing on our global 2014 data, and now I'm pleased to share on our next slide here a little bit of the background on perceptions around climate change in Canada specifically for 2015 with data we just collected a couple of months ago. Of course, one way that Canadians relate to climate change is through weather. We all love talking about weather endlessly and endlessly and endlessly. And a good starting point is the extent to which people see recent extreme weather patterns as highly unusual and alarming, or just kind of unusual and slightly worrisome, or part of a not natural pattern, or even not happening at all. And we see that a majority of people perceive recent extreme weather as at least unusual and slightly worrisome, and a good chunk of 30% just this year, with an increase in proportions from 2004, just before Katrina, see recent extreme weather as highly unusual and alarming. So people are starting to make that connection, and it's interesting to go to the next slide to see the extent to which people get causality, or at least where they land on what some might call a debate in terms of the cause of extreme weather patterns. Here we are comparing their choices according to human causes and non-human causes, and we can see that a majority of Canadians choose human causes, and the largest proportion, 37%, say extreme weather is related to human-caused climate change and carbon dioxide concentrations. Another 15% say it's related just to pollution, and thankfully a small number link it back to ozone depletion. Now, we still have a sizable chunk of the population who believe, and this has been stable, that recent extreme weather is really just sort of cyclical and natural, and that's sort of a constituency that's always been there. But on the next slide, where we look at our tracking on this, we do see some slight growth from 2000 to 2015 in the percentages of people linking extreme weather directly to human-caused climate change. But this other chunk of 27%, fairly stably, and in fact increased from 2000, link extreme weather to natural cycles. So there seems to be some sort of growth in knowledge, but still some quite defined sort of blocks of people. And on the next slide, how does this translate into the need of action or perceived urgency of doing something about climate change? This is just a very basic reading we've been taking among Canadians over the years, even farther back than 2007. And we sort of ask people to make a choice among three, and they choose whether they think it's necessary to take major steps starting very soon. It's necessary to take some steps, that's kind of the wishy-washy middle ground, whether it's not necessary to take any steps. And very small proportions of people react to this question with the point of view that, nah, we shouldn't do anything. Instead, we have almost two-thirds saying, this is urgent, it's time to do something about it. And while that portion of the population has decreased in size somewhat since 2009, it's still there, and in fact has increased slightly since 2013. So there does seem to be some foundation for some form of action on this in terms of political appetite. But as I think you'll all agree, on the next slide, we can see that the debate around this is always sort of couched in terms of trade-offs, economic trade-offs. And so where do Canadians come down on that debate? Well, they're pretty divided. This is sort of a wedge issue in terms of whether people think that the economy will be significantly damaged if we take action to reduce climate change emissions. However, there is a slight tip in favor of those who disagree with that notion. 51% disagree that the economy will be negatively affected, and a smaller proportion agree. So it's still, at least in terms of the economic discourse, it's still a bit of a political football. And if you look back at a long time series on the next slide, back to 2007, you can see some movement around where people have come down on this, but it's been fairly stable. In other words, there hasn't been, any major swing in opinion on this dimension of the conversation. Nothing certainly to trigger immediate action on the political front right now, which is interesting, and I'm sure Alex will touch upon issues around timing some more. But on the engagement side, people do seem to be becoming slightly more knowledgeable about at least what the scientific consensus is around causality for climate change. Now, what about companies? Where do companies fit into this? And on the next slide suggests that there is quite a bit of pressure on corporate actors from publics, from voters, at least to encourage governments to do more to address climate change. So this is about advocacy, and all of our work around leadership suggests that it is one of at least 6 very important attributes in terms of what can differentiate a leadership company from the followers of the pack. So Canadians do see a role for the private sector, at least to the extent that they're influencing government. And so how does this all pan out when it comes to support for carbon pricing? We've looked at it one way, and it's a fairly vague way. On the next slide, we ask Canadians whether they favor or oppose raising taxes on CO2 emitting fuels, both for businesses and individuals. And again, Canadians are fairly split and have been since 2007. there is a slight skew towards favorability. In other words, there's just the political license to get away with doing something like this. But it has weakened slightly, and perhaps that may relate to the timing too. So is an economic approach, using economic instruments, really the right place to go? Is this the right solution? And I thought it worthwhile to spend the last couple of minutes here reflecting back on our surveys of sustainability experts and practitioners across about 90 countries who are involved in sustainability in all sectors. So those in government, those in companies, those in NGOs, those in consultancy and research positions as well. And as we sort of wrapped up the last sort of era around the end of the Kyoto period in 2012, we asked our panel to rank the most effective approaches to reducing climate change. And here we see that economic instruments does come out as the top. It's seen as having the most potential, and a slightly larger proportion of our panel believes that they're most effective compared with regulatory approaches. Diplomacy doesn't rank highly at all, nor does public education or persuasion for behavior change. And it's interesting on the next slide just to break this out a little bit by audience. So how do experts working in companies and governments feel about economic instruments? Well, they're both more likely than average to choose economic instruments as potentially the most effective. So at least there's some agreement there and some consensus on the way forward. But then we need to break this down a little bit. Economic instruments is fairly vague. So what does it come down? What's the best approach to that? And on our final slide here, we've asked experts to tell us how effective they think various different economic approaches are to. And it's interesting to compare what is seen as most effective to what is seen as least effective. So we have carbon tax as seen as the most effective, and that had remained as ranked number one since about 2006. At the bottom, however, we find emissions trading systems. And we've seen a decrease in percentages seeing trading emissions systems as effective between 2006 and 2012. So one assessment based on the opinion research, both from the public and our panel of experts, suggests that we've gone in the right direction, but there's still some devil in the details. And I'll hand it over to Alex to talk in more detail about that.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to pause just for 1 second and see if there's any questions coming in online specifically for Eric in his presentation?
There's one question.
Is there? Do you want to address that now while we're hot off?
It depends what the question is.
Okay, we'll give you the right one. Go ahead, Steph.
So the question is, I live in Toronto, but I'm from Colombia, and my company, Sustainability, in brackets, operates in Colombia. Do you have any numbers or studies on Colombia about all of these issues?
We have some in our archives for sure, but we do not have a depth in Colombia itself. Offline, we can take that one and I'll see what we might be able to pull up.
It might be more sort of South America more broadly?
Right. Certainly Brazil, right. Mexico, Argentina, Chile.
Okay. I have one just brief question I wanted to ask you before we move on. You mentioned losing the room. That we may have lost the room on this conversation with some folks, and I think you were connecting that with some of the language shift, and that people, at least based on the survey respondents, were receptive to the term global warming, but maybe the idea of climate change was scary or somehow alienating. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Sure. I think climate change, quote, climate change, has been part of the public discourse for years now. And I don't think it's become really much more clear in anyone's mind, not only what the implications of that are, how it will be manifested, but what we might be able to do about it. It still feels long-term implications out in the future for people, whereas the warming gets very sort of specific. And that term, of course, has been problematic as well, because we talk about cooling in some places and warming in others that are disproportionate. That's my personal sense of that, but I think it's really about a lack of demonstrated leadership among governments, many governments, particularly in Canada, and just a handful of major corporate actors globally taking a leadership role in this.
Great. Thanks very much. Alex,
right.
You.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Eric, for that fascinating number. So I'm going to talk more from the policy perspective, both in terms of what we know basically about the major strands of climate policy, particularly around carbon pricing. And what I'll have to say is based on some of the briefing notes that we circulated to Steve, and I think he may have circulated to you already, providing a basic level of knowledge basically around the rationale for these instruments, some of the key concepts, key points that relate to those instruments, and then talk a bit about the actual experience on the ground with them, and then maybe take a bit of a look forward in terms of what may be happening over the coming year. But I'll start with, we can go to the first slide there, Stephanie. I'll talk just briefly about where I come from, Sustainable Prosperity, which is a green economy think tank, do tank we call it as well, based at the University of Ottawa. Our basic model is to take research, particularly from the academic community, and to translate it for policy and business audiences into different products, to engage obviously with those communities, the policy and business community, in a discussion of what that research tells us about the pursuit of a sustainable economic system. As the bullet point says there, we are very focused on the economic case for a green economy. So we take some of the environmental and social benefits in some ways for granted, and I'm happy to pick that up and to say what it is we have to say about that, but it really, our work focuses on that economic case. Next slide, please. So just to review, why we need climate policy. The environmental benefits, as I've said, are things that we essentially take as a given. Stabilizing the climate, addressing any kind of climate variability or climate change, obviously, is the big environmental benefits, but we know there are others as well. What we're focused on, and what I'll touch on very briefly here, are the economic benefits of acting, of bringing in smart climate policies. So the first of those economic benefits are the avoided costs of direct climate change impacts. Avoiding climate change is good economics, just because we know the impacts have been severe and will get even more severe over time. We have some work that was done by the National Roundtable on the Environment and Economy probably 4 or 5 years ago now, putting the number in terms of damage to Canada, costs of the direct impacts of climate change at $55 billion a year by 2050. We also know that there are a host of other economic benefits related to the indirect impacts or the avoidance of those indirect impacts, things like healthcare, things like agricultural productivity, and the impacts, for the most part negative, that climate change would have on those issues. And I've just seen over the last couple of days a couple of major studies, one coming out of Australia, one coming out of the U.S., related to, again, quantifying the considerable health benefits of acting on climate change. And so those numbers are starting to come online, and those numbers are growing. And then the final one, which is the more positive, affirmative side of the equation, and which we could probably spend an hour talking about just on that topic, and I'm happy to come back and do some versus there. But it's essentially around the emerging markets for clean energy and low-carbon solutions. Canada, in some ways, at least from our perspective, is a bit of an outlier in terms of where some of the major OECD economies are going. An increased focus, political focus, economic focus on building up low-carbon energy solutions, low-carbon energy systems, considerable investment going into those systems, and new markets emerging for the solutions to feed those systems. And Canada does okay in that world, but our view is we could do a lot better with the right policy frame in mind. So from that, I'll dive right into the thorny question of carbon pricing, which is, you know, as most of you will know, is the signature climate policy, or the one that gets an awful lot of ink and an awful lot of debate on. I'll come back at the end about how to balance that out with some other considerations. But let's talk about carbon pricing, and my intent really is here to give you kind of a base of what the theory shows, but also what the experience shows in terms of what that tool can bring to us. And it really is, it should be seen as a tool. So first question is, why is pricing carbon considered what economists would call the first best climate policy? And the answer to that is because it directly addresses the market failure that is at the core of climate change. Sir Nicholas Stern, who's a famous economist in the UK, who generated or was commissioned to put together the Stern report by the UK government back in 2008, 2009, famously said, climate change is the mother of all market failures. So that's, you know, in terms of good policy design and aligning a policy signal directly to a particular issue, knowing that climate change is essentially a market failure, and we can talk about market failure as a concept a bit, carbon pricing hits that market failure or addresses that market failure right on, which is why it's considered first best policy. The other reason, though, is because it provides a transparent and ongoing policy signal that directly affects economic decision-making and behavior. So again, it is a signal to everyone in the economy that emitting carbon into the atmosphere comes at a price, which right now, for the most part, is not the case. Once that price is attached to emitting carbon, in theory, we will all do things to avoid paying that price. And the more we do those things, the more people offer up solutions. The cost of avoiding emissions in the atmosphere, in theory, again, will decline. Just a bit on this market failure concept, and what does it in fact refer to? Basically, a market failure, and this is specific to climate change and the pollution that causes climate change. A market failure is the difference between the private price of particular activity. So think about filling up your gas tank in your car. You pay a particular price for that, but burning that gasoline by driving around emits CO2 and other pollutants into the atmosphere. Those pollutants create a social cost that all of us bear, and that you as an individual do not necessarily bear in that. So those costs show up somewhere in our society. Think about healthcare costs as the most direct example, but climate stability or climate instability is the other kind of cost. And the idea, the economic concept is addressing that failure will go a long way to addressing the problem that it creates. So there is an optimal, what they call the social cost of carbon, that reflects essentially the marginal cost of the CO2 that you are putting into the air. So it's essentially a damage function. It's a number that tells you, okay, 1 ton of CO2 into the atmosphere is causing X amount of damage, and that social damage, that social cost, needs to be reflected in the cost that we pay for emitting that CO2. There's a lot of work that goes on about what that social cost of carbon could be. The Government of Canada, in fact, has a social cost of carbon that it uses in its policy making, its regulatory development. That number is $28.50 in 2009 dollars. So, but that number, as you might expect, given the wide range of science that exists around what, in fact, climate change will do to us, that number is, it's fair to say, all over the place. I mean, you see on this next slide, essentially, a meta-analysis showing where that number sits based on however many number of studies are reflected there. They all cluster, you know, the bell curve is at the start between $0 and $100, but they do extend all the way up to $1,000 in some cases. And so the point here is the social cost of carbon is a very important tool, and some companies are using an analogous tool in something called a shadow carbon price in the decision-making that they make. But figuring out exactly what that price will be is no small feat. So, turning now to the case for carbon pricing in terms of its design. The case for carbon pricing rests essentially on two factors. First, its environmental effectiveness, for it will reduce emissions done the right way. But the second one is really the kicker, its economic efficiency. So it will reduce those emissions at a lower cost to society than a regulatory approach, for example. The idea or the trigger behind that is that a well-designed pricing policy essentially provides flexibility for those who are facing compliance around emission reductions. And it also, because of this signal that I said it provides, it creates essentially an incentive to innovate your way out of the problem, because every less ton you emit, you get rewarded for. The basic concept in environmental economics literature is that regulations tend to create what they call regulatory fatigue. You will go right up to the point of regulation, you will meet your regulation, but you will have no incentive to go beyond regulation, essentially. But with a price signal, that incentive to go beyond, because there is no beyond, essentially, it's whatever you can bring in, continues to exist. So, looking now specifically at the kinds of carbon pricing that exist out there, and this will touch a bit on what Eric reflected in terms of the attitudes around this, but there's essentially, or economists traditionally talk about three forms of pricing carbon. And interestingly enough, we find all three of these systems in Canada, so I can talk a bit about the real-world experience. The first is a carbon tax. The simplest, most elegant, what every economist will tell you he or she wants because of its simplicity and elegance. It is what exists or has existed and continues to exist in BC since 2008. It's a straightforward price attached to the carbon content of a good or services that you are requiring in the marketplace. And it can be levied upstream, it can be levied downstream, depending on the design features. The second type of system is a cap and trade system, which is what we now have in Quebec since, well, for a couple of years now. Quebec, the progression is Quebec had a carbon tax, a very low level of carbon tax. Starting a year ago, they essentially folded that into a cap and trade system, and just about 6 months ago linked that cap and trade system with the existing system in California. So Quebec and California now trade in allowances, emission allowances. And just this past month, as Steve was saying, Ontario announced that it would join Quebec and California in that system. And so in theory, at some point, Ontario, Quebec, California will be creating allowances, the government will be creating allowances, distributing those or auctioning those to businesses in those jurisdictions. And then those businesses will be able to trade, buy and sell those allowances in a completely fungible market, whether it comes from Quebec or California. In theory, the atmosphere really doesn't care where that emission reduction comes from. So I'll talk about the sort of advantages of that. The last system to talk about is called a baseline and credit system, and that's what happens, or that's what is in existence in Alberta, at least for the next 24 hours or so. We'll see after the election there what happens. But that system is basically what is considered an intensity-based system. So it basically says you must improve your emissions performance by a certain percentage, not by an absolute number, but by a percentage. So it's essentially an efficiency standard for emissions. And the great advantage to that is that it allows you to continue to grow your emissions and presumably your business, particularly if you're in the energy sector, while trying to essentially curve or adjust the curve of your emissions downward. Now, it's also the case, and I'll talk a bit more about this, that you can have hybrids of these various systems. So features of a carbon tax attached to features of a cap and trade, so on and so forth, and I'll talk a bit about those. Next slide is just a quick review of what we have in terms of carbon pricing programs around the world. You'll note there that, in fact, neither Alberta or Ontario are included, which is an oversight, so I suspect there are other oversights, but the big one, and the one that is going to make news over the years, starting next year, is what's going to happen in China. China has been piloting essentially a number of regional and city-based cap and trade systems over the last 3-4 years. They are going to roll that up into one national system within the next 2 years, and so there will be a national cap and trade system in China within a couple of years now, which you know, if you follow the international discussion on this and the requirement that a lot of the developed countries are now placing on action by developing countries, the fact that China is moving forward on this is going to change the equation considerably. Okay, now let's talk about the carbon pricing options in terms of the pros and cons of them, because they each have their own, nothing is as simple as making the best choice. They each have features that, you know, that recommend them, but none of them is perfect. The carbon tax provides price certainty, and so that's a very attractive feature for businesses who would like to know exactly what price they will be paying for carbon out into some future point in time. And as an example, again, the BC carbon tax was designed with $5 a year incremental increases over a period of 5 years. It's now capped at $30. But the idea was you give the market and you give businesses a very clear, transparent schedule around which you are going to increase this price. They will understand that those costs will increase over time and therefore will adjust accordingly. But that price certainty does not give you certainty in terms of emission reductions. Referring back to that social cost of carbon discussion, I can't tell you, and no one in this country can tell you, what the price of carbon should be to achieve certain reductions. And so you can bring in a carbon tax at a certain rate. You have no guarantee what kind of reductions that will in fact create in the economy. So if you're more concerned about quantity certainty, that is certainty in how much you're going to actually reduce, then you look at a cap and trade system, because that certainty is essentially provided by the cap. The government says to those sectors that are covered, here is the limit on what you're allowed to emit this year. What that does then under the cap is create some price volatility, and you know there are lots of stories out there about the various mistakes, I guess, that have been made in places like the European trading system around the design of that system, lots of price volatility, and I suspect that some of the numbers that you see that Eric was talking about in terms of people's, I guess, less than enthusiastic response to cap and trade systems is a lot of basically a baggage attached to this European trading system. The baseline and credit system, so the one that's operating in Alberta, really doesn't provide you certainty in anything, because it gives you no certainty in terms of the absolute reductions. It doesn't really give you certainty in terms of prices either. What it does is it allows you to manage growth in an economy in a more, and I guess in a more politically acceptable way. Next slide. As I say here, in practice, the tendency is towards a hybrid pricing system. So Alberta, the baseline credit system, has a price floor essentially. So firms operating in Alberta know that they never have to pay more than $15 a ton, because if they find themselves in a situation where they're going to essentially be over their efficiency standard, they can pay $15 a ton into what is this climate change, I can't remember the acronym, but it's referred to colloquially as the tech fund in Alberta. So The $15 ton essentially acts as a price ceiling for, I said price floor, but it's essentially a price ceiling the other way around, for Alberta businesses. In Quebec and California, and very soon for Ontario, what's been brought in there to address the issue of volatility within a market trading system, such as been shown and has been the case in the European trading system, is essentially the creation of these price collars. So there's an upper bound to the price, there's a lower bound to the price. And governments maintain essentially a kind of a hand on the tiller, essentially. They're either releasing more allowances into the system if the price goes above a certain, or withholding allowances if it goes down below a certain level. So what you see in places like Ontario and Quebec and California is essentially, cap and trade version 2.0, the lessons of the European trading system applied with these price collars to manage some of the volatility that has plagued the European system. All right, I've got a bunch of things here on design considerations, which is really kind of wonky stuff about how you design the best possible policy. And, I can go back to that if anybody really wants to dig into that, but I'm mindful of the time. I will say that so not this slide, but the next one, there are a number of things that governments need to think about when they're bringing in a carbon pricing system, and certainly this is part of the discussion that Ontario is having right now with various stakeholders. The first one is the competitive impact of bringing in a carbon pricing system. The reality is there certainly will be winners, but there will be losers, and the shorthand for those losers are usually what are called energy-intensive and trade-exposed sectors. So folks who are very heavy users of energy, and because energy prices traditionally or typically go up because of carbon pricing, they're exposed on that side, but also they're trade exposed. So they're selling into markets and competing against businesses that may not face the same carbon pricing situation. So how to address their concerns is a big issue, and there are design features to do that. The distributional impacts of any policy. Carbon pricing, a lot of people consider regressive, meaning that it hits lower income households more greatly than it does higher income households. There's some dispute around that, but I think people generally agree that it is regressive or can be regressive, and so there are, again, policy features, policy fixes that you can bring to bear on that. Jurisdictional linkages. Should you go to a system, should you go, like Ontario is going, to a trading system with others? And there I would say the evidence is pretty clearly that there are substantial gains from trade to be made. It is cheaper for a market system if the market is larger, just because there is greater liquidity, greater fungibility between what is being traded. Now there's a contrary view to that, which is that, and certainly this is a view in Alberta, that linking with other systems means essentially a redistribution of wealth from a high emitting jurisdiction to a low emitting jurisdiction. That's a very real consideration, and so I thought I'd put it out there. Offsets. Offsets are essentially emission reduction activities that happen outside of what are traditionally called the covered sectors, so the power sector, the transportation sector. If you're, for example, a woodlot owner or a forestry operator, you can, and there are protocols to do so, create offsets by essentially sustainably logging or replanting trees. Those trees acting as carbon sinks mean a certain amount of carbon is not going into the atmosphere. You can then take that credit, that offset credit, and sell it to someone who, in fact, needs to reduce their emissions. There are big administrative issues. I won't get into that. The real-life experience now of this kind of stuff, and very quickly. So, next slide, please. The BC carbon tax. We've done quite a bit of work on this. The BC carbon tax is, for lots of reasons, the poster child for carbon pricing. It has been very successful both from a policy perspective. It has reduced emissions while the BC economy has continued to grow. It has reduced those emissions for those fuels essentially covered by it. And it has also sort of created this win-win, which is that the BC government gets about $500 million from the BC carbon tax, and that money, by legislation, in fact, is money that it then returns to BC households and income and businesses in the form of tax cuts. So it's considered a revenue-neutral tax, essentially. So a very successful example of a carbon pricing policy, and a lot of the reason why economists, again, sort of love the tax as a concept. The other feature of it is that from a gleam in the eye of Gordon Campbell to implementation of a BC carbon tax was about 6 months of time, whereas cap-and-trade systems tend to take a lot longer to get off the ground. But a carbon pricing system or a cap-and-trade system is what we have in Ontario, or will have in Ontario, but certainly have now in Quebec and California. And the next slide will talk a bit about some early research that we're doing in that area. But basically, what Quebec and California are starting to demonstrate is this argument over this evidence around the gains from trade that can be achieved through linking cap-and-trade systems. What you see on the graph are basically the prices that California used to pay on the upper, the light green line, and that Quebec paid early on. And what you have is a movement to the center as both of those prices equalize. That means for California, which is a relatively carbon-intensive economy, cheaper emission reduction opportunities. For Quebec, because of its hydro, obviously a much lower carbon intensity jurisdiction, those allowances that it has gaining more value in the marketplace, essentially. So again, it's early days in terms of talking about some of the actual emission reductions, but given that those are absolute caps, we can expect that what Quebec and California say will be the emission reductions to achieve are almost certainly likely to be the case, although we're going to keep a close eye on that. So quick wrap-up stuff here. Beyond carbon pricing, because I've talked about carbon pricing, but as I said at the outset, climate policy is much more than just carbon pricing, and we often talk about carbon pricing as being the necessary but not sufficient condition for addressing climate change. It is the single most important instrument, but it is far from the only one. There are other policy tools that may be required to secure reductions. Standards and regulations do have a role to play in those areas where pricing may just not happen or may not work very well for things like how people react to price increases, what economists call the elasticity of demand for certain things. But there's also a whole host of I guess, investments that need to be made in what we would call public good type of factors. So the big one would be infrastructure, public transit, smart grid, things that no individual business is going to invest in because the benefits are kind of diffuse, but for which governments, for which there is a strong case for public investment. And so, when we talk to governments typically about climate policy, we're not talking only about carbon pricing, but we are talking about these other factors, and I'm happy to talk more about this. I've got a couple of other slides that talk about, ultimately, climate policy is about everything. It's a bit of an echo to my first slide, which was we take the environmental benefits of dealing with climate change as a given. What we're most focused on, and I think what a lot of governments are increasingly focused on, is the economic dimension of climate change, both as a challenge but also as an opportunity. So I've touched on my last or second to last slide here about where there are areas where now governments are starting to link climate change policy, both as thinking about how these things like tax policy, transportation policy, certainly drive greater emissions, but also where the opportunities exist to lower emissions. So, point being, you need a pretty broad scope to deal with climate change if you're a government, if you're thinking about policy, and all of these areas and others are top of the list. I'll just finish off with one last slide, which is talking a bit about this roadmap for a greener economy. We're taking this climate change work and we're kind of raising it at a level even higher, and I've talked to Steve about maybe coming back to talk to you guys about some of this work. I just thought I'd give a teaser here. We're thinking more and more about the language and the framing around a green and a greener Canadian economy and what that looks like, and so I hope to be able to come back and talk to you about this in some future point. But thanks for the opportunity, and happy to take questions.
Thanks very much, Alex. Steph, do we have any questions come in online?
So there's a question from Pete. He says, can you give specific events and costs? So that's probably detail.
Yeah, Pete, if you can use the chat feature just to clarify the events and costs that you'd like us to respond to. And perhaps while you're thinking of that, we'll go to our next question.
About weather events.
Oh, specific weather events and the costs associated. I know I can respond quickly. I know that certainly Intact Insurance as well as the cooperators have been researching this pretty extensively for their own businesses. Obviously, catastrophic claims that insurance companies are covering have changed dramatically. I saw Kathy Bardswick from the cooperators speak to this, and she said it's gone from sort of $1 million problem to $1 billion problem within the lifespan of her career in the insurance business, and so that's been a very that's driven a lot of their decisions around making climate change a core focus of their business strategy. And I'm sure Intact Insurance would say the same. I'm less familiar with them. So I know that they're monitoring, say, for example, the Calgary floods, for example, and the costs associated with the cleanup and the rebuilding and the infrastructure challenges there. So I think that information is clearly published. I don't have access to that right now, but I think that's readily available.
Well, in the Toronto, you guys had a bit of an issue last summer as well. There's the Calgary floods brings up an interesting issue, which is insurance as a driver of change on this issue, and how a lot of people I talk to think it will be insurance that basically insurance is where it will hit people the most directly, because rates will go up, but more to the point, certain things will not be insured anymore. And if we're in a situation where governments are the insurers of last resort, as they are for large swaths of our economy, that will come home to roost at some point in the terms of the ability of governments to pay for this kind of, and us to pay for this kind of stuff. So,
but it is a very real and natural market signal that's already in operation, which is worth saying.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any other questions online, Steph?
Yep. So here's one from Whitney. She says, Alex, you mentioned that standards/regulations are needed to supplement carbon pricing for activities that aren't incentivized enough by pricing to make changes. Can you please provide some examples of such activities?
Yeah. Well, the classic one would be vehicle standards. We know that in fact one of the when you look at in Ontario and in fact in North America, what has been happening with emissions and what is likely to happen with emissions over the next 20 to 30 years, with the exception of the energy sectors, both in Canada and increasingly in the U.S., you have generally declining emission profiles for just about everything that we do, meaning we're more efficient. We are emitting less carbon as a percentage. So as an efficiency number, not always as an absolute number. But one of the big stories will be the rather dramatic increases in vehicle efficiency standards over the next 5, 10, 20 years. I mean, we're essentially talking about with new standards that were brought in a couple of years ago, we're talking about essentially a doubling of efficiency for the average, you know, what they call the CAFE there, the corporate average fuel efficiency. So cars are going to get more efficient, and that is based on a standard, right? Because one of the things that we know is that a carbon price, when it comes through the signal, such as at the fuel pump, does not always translate in there's a weird psychology that people have done a lot of studying around in terms of fuel prices, right? Some of that psychology may be changing, and BC is in fact an interesting test case for this, because the standard, I guess, the conventional wisdom on this in the past has been people don't base car purchasing decisions on what they expect long-term energy prices to be, because they always assume, and evidence has always proven them right, that whatever goes up comes down in terms of energy prices. So yeah, I may be paying a lot more at the pump now, but you know what, by next summer the price will have come down. So I don't really need that more efficient vehicle. Well, that sets up a tough conversation about just what role carbon pricing can play in that, and that's where standards can play a very important role.
That's great. Anything else online, Steph?
Here's a question from Hardeep. Overall, do you feel the move for Ontario to go with carbon pricing is the right one? When it comes to presenting results for the program to the public, will there be difficulties?
I do think it's the right one. I think carbon pricing, as I said, is the necessary element of any climate strategy. I hope and I trust that it is not the end-all and be-all of what they have to announce on this. And in fact, there's a very real issue about how you bring in a cap-and-trade system and how it essentially interacts with other policies. And the shorthand for this is, and this is something that I learned when looking at a presentation on the California cap-and-trade system. The way California thinks about the cap-and-trade system is it measures every reduction caused by every other policy that it is put into place, such as fuel efficiency standards, which are even more strict in California. And then at the end of that, it figures out, okay, how many emissions are in fact left that have not been addressed by other policies? That's what we're capping. That's the road Ontario has to go down, or else it risks distorting all kinds of policies that it already has in place. On the communication and basically, you know, proving to people that that this is delivering results, I personally think that that's the big reason they've gone to a cap-and-trade system. That because there is certainty around the actual level of reduction that you've achieved, because the cap sets that reduction, it is much easier for the political class to go out and say, yes, we have done this, we brought in this policy and it wasn't terribly popular, but here are the results, right? A tax, especially if tying a tax to a particular outcome is very tough, as I said. A certain level of taxation, you're never sure what it's going to deliver in terms of an emissions outcome. A cap, you're always going to be sure about that, and I think for politicians, that's a very attractive feature of the system.
And that takes us to, we're actually just a minute over 2 o'clock. What I might suggest, if there are any other questions coming in online, is we can capture those and perhaps respond by email if there's any sort of pressing questions. I want to thank you, Eric, for joining us, and also Alex, and thank all of you on the phone. It's quite a popular session today, so thank you for coming out in numbers for what I think is an incredibly important topic and something that's going to be in the news and front and center for us, not just this year, for many years to come. So thanks again. Next event for CBSR online, I think we've got our Transformational Company Guide launch coming up in June, so stay tuned for that. Thanks again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye for now.
Thanks. Thank you, Steve.